September 1967. South Vietnam rice paddies stretch endless under a scorching sun. Marine sniper doctrine is absolute. Two-man teams, short stalks, spotter backup. Never crawl alone. Then Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock slides a white feather into his bush hat and requests an unauthorized mission. Crawl 1,500 yards solo to kill Hanoi's most protected officer. 4 days, 3 nights, inches at a time across enemy territory. His chain of command calls it suicide. The North Vietnamese believe their senior officers are untouchable behind layered defenses and patrol zones no American would dare cross. But sometimes the deadliest shot in war isn't about perfect aim. It's about the impossible crawl that gets you close enough to pull the trigger. The helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm as it lifted off from Hill 55, carrying Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock toward what his commanding officers considered a death sentence. Below, the patchwork of rice paddies and broken tree lines stretched toward the Phu Bai sector, where North Vietnamese army patrols moved like ghosts through terrain they had controlled for months. At 25 years old, with 93 confirmed kills already carved into his record, Hathcock had earned the right to make impossible requests. This morning, he had made one that left his chain of command speechless. The morning had started like any other at the Marine sniper compound. Hathcock was cleaning his rifle, the accurized version of the M14 that had become an extension of his will, when Lance Corporal Jimmy Martinez burst through the tent flap. Martinez was 19, fresh-faced, with the kind of eager energy that Vietnam had not yet beaten out of him. He had been Hathcock's spotter for 3 months, learning to read wind patterns and calculate holdovers with the precision of a mathematician. But this morning, Martinez carried news that would change everything. "Gunny, we lost Patterson's squad," Martinez said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Ambush, maybe 2 clicks from the perimeter. NVA officers set it up perfect. Patterson and 3 others didn't make it back." Hathcock's hand stilled on his rifle. Staff Sergeant Mike Patterson had been a friend, a good Marine who knew how to keep his men alive, the kind of leader the Corps could not afford to lose. But more than grief, Hathcock felt something else building in his chest, the cold calculation that separated snipers from ordinary infantrymen. Within an hour, intelligence reports filtered down through channels. The NVA officer responsible for Patterson's death was identified as a senior commander, operating from a heavily defended position near Phu Bai. He moved between camouflaged command posts, protected by overlapping patrol routes, and situated in terrain that made conventional assault impossible. The distance from any conceivable Marine position to the target zone measured 1,500 yards of open ground, broken only by abandoned rice paddies and scattered tree lines that offered no meaningful cover. Captain Robert Wilson, the sniper detachment commander, laid out the tactical situation with brutal honesty. "Gentlemen, this target is untouchable by current doctrine. We would need a 12-man team, close air support, and a week of preparation to even attempt an approach. The risk-to-benefit ratio is unacceptable." But Hathcock was already studying the aerial photographs, his mind racing through possibilities that doctrine had never contemplated. The Marine Corps Sniper Manual was explicit. Teams operated in pairs, with a spotter providing security and target identification. Movement was limited to hours of darkness, with prepared hide sites offering concealment during daylight hours. Maximum stalk distance was typically measured in hundreds of yards, not thousands. These rules had been written by men who understood the value of Marine lives and the necessity of bringing everyone home. But Hathcock saw something else in those regulations, the assumption that certain targets were simply beyond reach. That evening, Hathcock made his request through proper channels. He would volunteer for a solo mission, crawling 1,500 yards across enemy territory to eliminate the NVA commander. No spotter, no backup, no extraction plan beyond his own ability to crawl back the way he came. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Major Richard Edwards, the battalion executive officer, called it the most irresponsible proposal he had heard in 23 years of Marine service. "Sergeant Hathcock, you're talking about suicide. We do not send Marines on suicide missions." But Hathcock had done his homework. He presented meteorological data showing wind patterns that would mask his movement. He outlined a route that followed abandoned irrigation ditches and rice paddy berms, taking advantage of terrain features that aerial reconnaissance had missed. Most importantly, he showed them the photographs of Patterson's squad, 4 Marines who had died because the enemy felt safe behind his defensive perimeter. "Sir, if we don't take this target, he's going to keep killing Marines. The doctrine says it can't be done. Maybe it's time to prove the doctrine wrong." The debate continued for 6 hours, moving up the chain of command until it reached Colonel James Mitchell, who had been fighting in Vietnam since 1964 and understood that unconventional wars demanded unconventional solutions. Mitchell's decision was characteristically direct. Hathcock gets his shot, but this is off the books. If he doesn't come back, it never happened. The mission would be classified as a routine patrol, with Hathcock inserted at the edge of the operational area and given 72 hours to complete his objective. As the helicopter approached the drop zone, Hathcock performed his final equipment check with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours. His ghillie suit was woven with local vegetation, creating a camouflage pattern that would blend seamlessly with the abandoned rice fields. His rifle was zeroed for 700 yards, loaded with match-grade ammunition that would deliver precise terminal ballistics at extended range. Water, 1 canteen. Food, 3 days of rations compressed into packets small enough to fit in cargo pockets. Medical, field dressing, and morphine. Everything else was dead weight. The insertion point was a clearing 2 miles from the target zone, far enough from enemy patrols to avoid immediate contact, but close enough for Hathcock to reach his objective within the time limit. As the helicopter flared for landing, the door gunner gave him a thumbs up that carried more weight than any official blessing. Martinez had wanted to come, had argued and pleaded, until Hathcock finally explained the mathematics of the mission. 2 men would be twice as likely to be detected, twice as slow to move, twice as likely to die. This was a job for 1 Marine with nothing to lose but his own life. The helicopter lifted off, leaving Hathcock alone in enemy territory with 1,500 yards of open ground between him and a target that doctrine said was impossible to reach. As the rotor noise faded into the distance, he shouldered his rifle and began the crawl that would either validate everything he believed about the art of sniping or prove that some targets truly were beyond the reach of even the most determined Marine. The first movement was 6 inches. Hathcock pressed himself into the mud of an abandoned rice paddy, feeling the cold water seep through his utilities as he pushed forward with his elbows and toes. The technique was called the belly crawl, but that clinical term failed to capture the brutal reality of moving across 1,500 yards of enemy territory, 1 handful of earth at a time. His ghillie suit, carefully woven with rice stubble and marsh grass, became a second skin that scraped against every root and rock as he inched toward his objective. The terrain around Phu Bai was a sniper's nightmare masquerading as opportunity. What appeared from aerial photographs to be open rice paddies were actually a maze of irrigation ditches, abandoned berms, and scattered debris from years of fighting. Each paddy was separated by earthen dikes that rose 2 to 3 feet above the water level, providing momentary concealment, but also creating natural choke points where enemy patrols would concentrate their attention. Hathcock had studied these photographs until he could navigate the route with his eyes closed, but ground truth was always different from aerial intelligence. By nightfall of the first day, he had covered 300 yards. The progress was agonizingly slow, but deliberate. Every movement was calculated to coincide with natural sounds that would mask his approach. When the wind rustled through the bamboo groves, he moved. When artillery fire echoed from distant fire bases, he moved. When night birds called across the paddies, he froze and listened for the sounds that did not belong. The North Vietnamese army had been fighting in this terrain for years, and they knew every natural rhythm of the jungle. A single misplaced sound could bring a patrol down on his position within minutes. The rifle he carried was a testament to Marine Corps precision engineering. Based on the M14 platform, it had been accurized by the Quantico armorers with a match-grade barrel, adjustable trigger, and Redfield 3-9 power scope. The weapon system was zeroed for 600 yards, but Hathcock had calculated the ballistics for his intended shot at 700 yards. At that distance, his 173 grain match ammunition would drop approximately 12 inches below point of aim, requiring him to hold high on his target's center mass. Wind deflection at 10 miles per hour would push the bullet another 4 inches to the right, demanding precise reading of atmospheric conditions at the moment of engagement. The second night brought complications that no amount of planning could have anticipated. As Hathcock wormed his way through a section of broken rice stubble, he felt something smooth and muscular slide across his back. The bamboo viper was a common inhabitant of Vietnamese rice paddies, aggressive when threatened and deadly when it struck. For 30 minutes, the snake explored the contours of his ghillie suit while Hathcock lay motionless, controlling his breathing and fighting every instinct that screamed at him to move. The viper's tongue flicked against his neck, tasting the salt of his sweat before it finally disappeared into the darkness. The encounter with the snake crystallized something fundamental about the mission that Hathcock was only beginning to understand. Traditional sniper doctrine assumed that human enemies were the primary threat, but Vietnam had taught him that the environment itself could kill just as efficiently as enemy bullets. Heat stroke, dehydration, infection from contaminated water, and dozens of species of venomous creatures turned every mission into a battle for survival that extended far beyond the tactical engagement with enemy forces. As dawn approached on the third day, Hathcock reached the tree line that marked his final approach to the target area. He had covered over 1,000 yards in 48 hours, maintaining an average movement rate that military manuals would have considered impossible under combat conditions. His water consumption had been carefully rationed to 12 ounces per day, less than half the recommended intake for tropical operations. His heart rate, monitored by conscious effort, had never exceeded 110 beats per minute, even during the encounter with the Viper. From his position in the tree line, Hathcock could observe the enemy camp through his rifle scope. The North Vietnamese had chosen their location well, situating their command post on high ground that provided excellent fields of observation while remaining concealed from aerial reconnaissance. Camouflage netting stretched between trees, breaking up the geometric lines that American pilots were trained to identify. Supply trails approached the position from multiple directions, making it difficult to predict movement patterns or establish ambush sites. The target appeared exactly as intelligence reports had described: a senior officer in his 40s, moving with the confident bearing of a man who believed himself beyond the reach of American weapons. He wore the standard North Vietnamese Army uniform, but carried himself with an authority that marked him as someone accustomed to command. Through his scope, Hathcock could observe the officer's daily routine: morning inspection of defensive positions, briefings with subordinate commanders, and afternoon planning sessions conducted in the relative safety of a bunker complex. The range measurement confirmed Hathcock's calculations. Using the mil-dot reticle in his scope, he determined the distance to be 715 yards, close enough to his planned engagement range to require only minor adjustments to his holdover. Wind conditions were favorable, with a steady breeze from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. The atmospheric pressure was stable, and visibility was excellent. All the technical factors were aligning for a successful shot. But technical precision was only part of the equation. The real challenge was timing the engagement to maximize his chances of successful extraction. Once he fired, every North Vietnamese soldier in the area would know his approximate position. They would flood the tree line with patrols, cutting off his escape route and forcing him into a running battle that he could not win. The shot would have to be perfectly timed to coincide with the distraction that would delay their response long enough for him to begin his crawl back to friendly lines. As the third night fell, Hathcock settled into his final firing position and began the mental preparation that separated professional snipers from ordinary marksmen. He visualized the shot sequence, rehearsed his breathing pattern, and calculated the precise moment when atmospheric conditions would be optimal for engagement. Tomorrow morning, he would either validate a tactical theory that had never been tested in combat or become another casualty in a war that had already claimed too many Marines. The crawl that had brought him to this position was only half the mission. Getting home alive would require every skill he had learned in 2 tours of combat. Dawn broke on the 4th day with the kind of clarity that snipers pray for. The humidity that normally shrouded the Vietnamese highlands had lifted overnight, leaving the air crisp and still. Through his scope, Hathcock could count the individual buttons on the NVA officer's uniform as he emerged from his bunker for the morning inspection ritual that intelligence had documented for weeks. The range was 715 yards. Wind speed had dropped to less than 5 miles per hour from the northwest. Atmospheric pressure was stable. Every technical factor that could influence bullet trajectory was falling into alignment. Hathcock controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate to the mechanical rhythm that allowed for precise shot placement. The officer moved with deliberate steps along the defensive perimeter, stopping to examine fighting positions and speak with his subordinates. Through the Redfield scope, his face was clearly visible, showing the weathered features of a career soldier who had survived years of jungle warfare. This was not some faceless enemy target, but a professional military officer doing his job with the same dedication that Hathcock brought to his own duties. The crosshairs settled on center mass as the officer paused to review a map with 2 junior commanders. At this range, Hathcock's match-grade ammunition would deliver over 2,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, more than enough to ensure immediate incapacitation. He had calculated a holdover of 14 inches to compensate for bullet drop. Placing his point of aim at the officer's upper chest, wind deflection would push the bullet approximately 3 inches to the right, requiring a slight adjustment to his horizontal hold. The trigger press was smooth and deliberate, the culmination of thousands of hours of training condensed into a single moment of perfect execution. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with familiar authority, and through his scope, Hathcock watched the bullet's 2.1-second flight time compress into an eternity of anticipation. The officer's chest erupted in a spray of blood and tissue as the 173-grain projectile found its mark. He collapsed instantly, his body crumpling onto the wooden planking of the command post veranda. For exactly 4 seconds, the enemy camp remained frozen in confusion. Then chaos erupted as soldiers scrambled for defensive positions, shouting orders and pointing in the general direction of the tree line. Hathcock had already begun his extraction, rolling away from his firing position and into the deeper concealment of the forest canopy. The ghillie suit that had been his salvation during the approach now became crucial for survival as enemy patrols began their systematic search for the sniper who had penetrated their defensive perimeter. The return journey presented challenges that the approach had not. Where stealth had been his primary concern during the infiltration, now speed and deception became equally important. The North Vietnamese response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes of the shot, Hathcock could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles echoing through the forest as patrol teams began their sweep. Radio chatter filled the airways as enemy commanders coordinated their search efforts with the kind of professional efficiency that reminded him why this war had already lasted longer than anyone had expected. Moving in daylight across terrain now actively patrolled required adaptations to techniques that Hathcock had perfected during months of jungle operations. Instead of the steady belly crawl that had carried him to the target, he now employed what snipers called the high crawl, using his knees and elbows to achieve greater speed while maintaining a low profile. The technique was more exposed, but allowed him to cover ground at nearly 3 times his infiltration rate. The abandoned rice paddies that had provided concealment during his approach now became killing zones swept by enemy observation posts. Hathcock was forced to detour around open areas, following tree lines and irrigation ditches that added precious miles to his extraction route. Every deviation from his planned path increased the risk of stumbling into an enemy patrol or becoming trapped in terrain with no escape options. By midday, he had covered approximately 600 yards of his return journey when the ground beneath him suddenly gave way. The collapsed clay burrow had been excavated by Viet Cong sappers as part of a tunnel complex that intelligence had never detected. For a heart-stopping moment, Hathcock found himself waist-deep in loose earth, his rifle tangled in vegetation, completely exposed to anyone who might be watching. The sound of his fall seemed to echo across the paddies like a thunderclap. 30 yards away, an enemy patrol materialized from the jungle growth. 3 soldiers in the standard-issue green utilities of the North Vietnamese Army, moving with the careful precision of men who knew they were hunting a professional killer. Their leader carried an SKS rifle with a telescopic sight, marking him as a designated marksman trained in counter-sniper operations. They had heard the sound of collapsing earth and were moving to investigate with the methodical thoroughness of soldiers who understood that their quarry was wounded and possibly trapped. Hathcock pressed himself flat against the bottom of the burrow, controlling his breathing to the point where his chest barely moved. The patrol leader stopped less than 20 feet from his position, studying the disturbed earth with the kind of professional attention that comes from years of tracking human prey through jungle terrain. For 90 seconds, the three soldiers examined the area, their conversation carried on the still air in Vietnamese phrases that Hathcock could not understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. As the patrol moved away, continuing their systematic search of the area, Hathcock became aware of movement against his leg. The bamboo viper had returned, attracted perhaps by the warmth of his body or the vibration of his heartbeat. This time, the snake seemed less curious and more aggressive, its triangular head weaving in the distinctive pattern that preceded a strike. For the second time in 4 days, Hathcock found himself in a contest of will with a creature that could kill him as efficiently as any enemy soldier. The snake's exploration of his ghillie suit continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than 10 minutes. When it finally disappeared into the network of tunnels that honeycombed the area, Hathcock realized that his encounter with Vietnamese wildlife had become a metaphor for the entire mission. Like the war itself, success depended not just on superior firepower or tactical training, but on the ability to coexist with an environment that was fundamentally hostile to American presence. As darkness fell on the 4th day, Hathcock emerged from the tunnel complex and resumed his crawl toward friendly lines. Behind him, enemy patrols continued their search with flashlights and flares that turned the night into a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Ahead lay another night of careful movement through terrain that had become infinitely more dangerous since his shot that morning. The mission was only half complete, and the hardest part still lay ahead. The radio crackled to life at 0530 hours as Hathcock crossed into the Marine defensive perimeter at Hill 55. White feather alive, target down, exfil complete. The words carried across the firebase with the weight of vindication, and within minutes, Marines were emerging from bunkers and fighting positions to witness the return of a man who had done what doctrine said was impossible. Captain Wilson was the first to reach him, his face a mixture of relief and something approaching awe as he helped Hathcock to his feet after 4 days of crawling through enemy territory. The debrief took place in the intelligence tent, where aerial photographs and tactical maps covered every available surface. Hathcock's account of the mission was methodical and precise, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone that Marines used when describing extraordinary events. Range to target, 715 yards. Wind conditions, 5 miles per hour from northwest. Time of engagement, 0645 hours. Enemy reaction time, approximately 4 seconds. The clinical details masked the human cost of what he had accomplished, but the intelligence officers understood the implications immediately. Within hours, confirmation arrived through multiple channels that the target had been eliminated. Intercepted radio traffic indicated significant disruption in enemy command structure, with subordinate units requesting guidance from commanders who were no longer available to provide it. Photo reconnaissance flights documented increased enemy patrol activity, but also revealed something more significant: the abandonment of the command post that had been considered impregnable just days earlier. The psychological impact of the assassination was already reshaping enemy tactics in ways that would benefit Marine operations for months to come. But success carried consequences that no one had anticipated. Colonel Mitchell's initial reaction was professionally positive, recognizing that Hathcock had proven the viability of extended solo operations under specific conditions. The mission report would be classified and distributed to sniper schools throughout the Marine Corps, providing a case study for tactics that pushed beyond conventional doctrine. However, the broader implications of what Hathcock had accomplished created friction within the command structure that had authorized his mission. Major Edwards, who had opposed the operation from its inception, raised concerns that went beyond tactical considerations. Sergeant Hathcock has demonstrated exceptional skill and courage, but he has also operated outside established protocols in ways that could set dangerous precedents. If we sanction unauthorized modifications to doctrine based on individual initiative, we risk undermining the command structure that keeps Marines alive. The criticism was couched in professional language, but its meaning was unmistakable. Hathcock had succeeded by going rogue, and success did not necessarily justify the methods. The debate continued for weeks as intelligence reports documented the enemy response to the assassination. Casualty rates in the Phu Bai sector increased by 18% over the following month as North Vietnamese forces implemented more aggressive patrol schedules and expanded their defensive perimeters. The moderate command presence that Hathcock had eliminated was replaced by hardline officers who showed less concern for minimizing civilian casualties and more willingness to engage Marine forces in direct confrontation. The tactical success had triggered strategic complications that no one had foreseen. Hathcock found himself caught between vindication and criticism, praised for his marksmanship while being questioned for his methods. The unofficial nature of his mission provided some protection from formal disciplinary action, but it also meant that his achievements could not be officially recognized through traditional channels. He had become living proof that individual initiative could overcome institutional limitations, but that proof came at the cost of challenging assumptions that senior officers were not ready to abandon. The psychological toll of the mission became apparent in the weeks following his return. Hathcock had always been introspective about the nature of his duties, understanding the moral complexity of taking human life even in wartime. But the extended isolation of the crawl, combined with the intimate nature of observing his target through a rifle scope, had created a level of personal connection that disturbed him in ways he struggled to articulate. The enemy officer had not been an anonymous figure glimpsed at a distance, but a professional soldier whose daily routines Hathcock had studied for hours before ending his life. Sleep became elusive as Hathcock replayed every detail of the mission, questioning decisions that had seemed obvious at the time. The encounter with the bamboo viper took on symbolic significance, representing the randomness of survival in an environment where death could come from directions that no amount of training could predict. He had controlled every variable that human skill could influence, but success had ultimately depended on factors beyond his control. That realization undermined the confidence that had sustained him through 2 tours of combat. Letters home to his wife became exercises in creative omission, describing routine patrol activities while omitting the details of missions that were classified beyond her security clearance. The disconnect between his public role as a Marine hero and his private struggles with the moral implications of his duties created an isolation that was more complete than anything he had experienced during his solo crawl through enemy territory. He had succeeded in ways that would influence Marine doctrine for decades, but that success came at a personal cost that he was only beginning to understand. The Marine Corps Sniper School at Quantico began incorporating lessons from Hathcock's mission into its curriculum within months of his return. The extended stalk techniques he had pioneered became part of advanced training programs, though instructors were careful to emphasize that such operations should only be attempted under exceptional circumstances by snipers with extensive combat experience. The tactical manual was updated to include provisions for solo operations when paired teams were not feasible, but these modifications were surrounded by cautionary language that reflected the institutional discomfort with tactics that pushed beyond established safety margins. As autumn turned to winter, Hathcock received word that he was being rotated back to training duties at Camp Pendleton. The assignment was presented as recognition of his expertise, an opportunity to pass his knowledge to the next generation of Marine snipers. But he understood the subtext. His unauthorized crawl had made him too valuable and too dangerous to risk in further combat operations. He had proven that individual initiative could overcome institutional limitations, but institutions had ways of containing individuals who challenged their authority, even successful ones. The training ranges at Camp Pendleton echoed with the crack of rifle fire as another class of Marine sniper candidates attempted to master the fundamentals that Hathcock had perfected in the jungles of Vietnam. From his position behind the firing line, he watched young Marines struggle with concepts that had become second nature during his combat tours. reading wind patterns at extended range, calculating holdover for elevated shots, controlling breathing under stress. But teaching these skills in the controlled environment of a California training facility felt like translating poetry into mathematics, capturing the mechanics while losing the essence. Staff Sergeant Hathcock, as he was now known to his students, had been assigned to the marksmanship training unit with orders to develop advanced sniper curriculum based on his combat experience. The irony was not lost on him that his unauthorized crawl, which had challenged established doctrine, was now being institutionalized as part of that same doctrine. The Marine Corps had found a way to absorb his innovation without acknowledging its revolutionary implications, transforming his act of individual initiative into standardized procedure that could be safely taught to future generations. The students who passed through his classes represented the evolution of Marine sniping from a specialized skill practiced by a few exceptional marksmen to a systematic capability that could be replicated across the Corps. They were younger than he had been when he first deployed to Vietnam, products of an expanded training pipeline that emphasized technical proficiency over the kind of intuitive understanding that only came from extended combat experience. They could recite ballistic formulas and identify camouflage patterns, but few understood the psychological dimensions of taking human life at extended range. One student in particular reminded Hathcock of his younger self, Corporal David Chen, a 19-year-old from San Francisco who had enlisted after two brothers were killed in action near Da Nang. Chen possessed the kind of natural marksmanship ability that could not be taught, consistently achieving sub-minute of angle accuracy at ranges that challenged even experienced instructors. But more importantly, he demonstrated the patience and attention to detail that separated professional snipers from ordinary marksmen. During field exercises, Chen would spend hours studying terrain features that other students dismissed as irrelevant, understanding instinctively that success in combat depended on factors that extended far beyond shooting ability. The curriculum that Hathcock developed incorporated lessons learned from his 1,500-yard crawl, but the institutional constraints of peacetime training meant that many of the most critical elements could not be replicated. Students learned stock techniques during daylight exercises that lasted hours rather than days. They practiced camouflage in environments where detection meant academic failure rather than death. They calculated range estimation and wind deflection using targets that did not shoot back. The training was comprehensive and professional, but it could not reproduce the psychological pressure that transformed theoretical knowledge into combat effectiveness. As months passed, reports from Vietnam documented the continuing evolution of sniper warfare based partly on techniques that Hathcock had pioneered. Extended solo operations became more common, though they were now conducted under strict protocols that attempted to minimize the risks that he had accepted as inevitable. The casualty rates among Marine snipers remained acceptable by military standards, but each death represented the loss of skills and experience that took years to develop. The institutional memory of warfare was written in blood, and Hathcock understood that his contribution to that memory had been purchased at a price that extended beyond his own service. The first symptoms of multiple sclerosis appeared in 1975, initially dismissed as fatigue from long hours on the training ranges. The tremor in his hands was subtle at first, affecting fine motor control in ways that frustrated his efforts to demonstrate shooting techniques. Medical evaluation confirmed what he had begun to suspect. His body was betraying the precision that had defined his military career. The disease was progressive and incurable, though its timeline remained unpredictable. He could continue teaching for several more years, but his days as an active shooter were ending. The diagnosis forced a reckoning with questions that Hathcock had avoided since returning from combat. His identity had been so completely defined by his abilities as a sniper that the prospect of losing those abilities threatened his sense of purpose in ways that were difficult to articulate. The white feather that had marked him as unique among Marines became a symbol of capabilities that were slowly disappearing, leaving behind memories of accomplishments that younger Marines knew only through stories and training manuals. Retirement from active duty in 1979 was presented as a natural transition for a senior non-commissioned officer who had served with distinction through 2 decades of Marine Corps service. The ceremony was conducted with full military honors, acknowledging achievements that could be publicly recognized while omitting classified operations that had shaped doctrine in ways that would not be revealed for years. Hathcock accepted the accolades with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his combat service, understanding that his most significant contributions might never receive the recognition they deserved. The years following retirement brought challenges that no amount of military training had prepared him to face. Civilian life required adaptations that were more difficult than any jungle stalk, forcing him to find purpose in activities that seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions that had defined his military service. The progression of his disease was gradual but relentless, robbing him of physical capabilities while leaving his mind sharp enough to remember what he had once been able to accomplish. The contrast between his peak performance and his declining abilities was a daily reminder of mortality that combat had somehow made abstract. Contact with former students provided some connection to the world he had left behind. Letters arrived periodically from Marines serving in various conflicts around the globe, describing situations where techniques learned at Camp Pendleton had proved their worth under combat conditions. Chen, now a gunnery sergeant serving in Lebanon, wrote that the patience and attention to detail he had learned during sniper training had saved his life during a particularly complex urban operation. The knowledge that his teachings continued to serve Marines in harm's way provided satisfaction that partially compensated for his own physical limitations. The Marine Corps maintained contact through periodic invitations to ceremonies and dedications that honored the contributions of Vietnam veterans. In 1996, a sniper training facility at Quantico was named in his honor, recognizing achievements that could finally be discussed openly after decades of classification. The dedication ceremony drew former students from across the country, men who had translated his teachings into their own combat effectiveness, and were now passing those lessons to another generation of Marines.